So now we have PJ. He's going to talk to us about what it's like to use DevOps versus what it should be, or what people say it should be.
So hi, my name is PJ Hagerty. I work at a company called DevRelate.io, and I'm here to talk to you a little bit about DevOps philosophy versus practice. We've seen a lot of practice going on this morning, and that's good. But sometimes you have to go back and focus on the basics. I assure you this, though, is not a basic talk. I will go as quickly as possible because, as I said, I am preventing you from eating lunch. A little bit about me. I sometimes forget to turn my clicker on. A little bit about me. So I hail from Buffalo, New York. Who knows Buffalo, New York? Who knows Buffalo, New York if you don't know the Buffalo Bills? Go Bills. I'm legally obligated to say that. So I'm in developer relations. If you don't know what that is, that means I get to go to conferences and talk a lot. I write a lot of content, do a lot of podcasts, and talk to a lot of people. I'm also a dad. I've been a musician my whole life. I did coach hockey at one point in time. This is a very old picture because my son's now 21, and if we took a picture now, you wouldn't be able to see me in it. And at one point, the picture at the bottom, I let my 11-year-old daughter keynote RubyConf. Don't ever do that. I work at DevRelate.io. It's a company that I founded in 2017. We do developer and community relations as a service. So we write content. We help people find their communities, figure out what they're doing. These are some of our great clients, some of which I will mention throughout the talk. Feel free to check all of them out at some point in time. You'll also notice that I'm wearing a shirt that says OSMI. My shirt is outdated. OSMI used to be called Open Sourcing Mental Illness. We have now rebranded to Open Sourcing Mental Health. I'm a board member there where we specifically talk about topics of mental health in tech. So for those of you who don't know, May is Mental Health Awareness Month. If you want someone to come and speak at your organization specifically about topics like ADHD, burnout, bipolar disorder, imposter syndrome, please get in touch. We are happy to provide speakers for you, whether that's remotely or directly on site. We do it for conferences, meetups, in-services, whatever you want to do. Mental health is a very serious issue in our industry, and the more we talk about it, the more people seek help. So please check out osmhhelp.org. But what we're here to talk about right now is DevOps. To say that DevOps is a buzzword is kind of weird because it's been around for like more than 15 years. I think it's like 17, but we had this pandemic thing that happened, and now I don't know anything in how old it is, but we'll just say 15 plus years. But it's still a buzzword. Like, what is it? Is it the new agile? Is it the bringing dev and ops together? Is that all there is to it? There's always talk and discussion about the philosophy of DevOps, but a lot of times people focus so much on the tooling and the how-to that they actually forget the ideas behind it. So today we're going to focus on the ideas and try to put everything together in one place. So we'll mention some tools, we'll talk about the philosophy itself and how that philosophy has actually evolved over time. But first, let's define DevOps as it stands today. And I'm going to use my special definition voice, so be ready. According to the strict definition of DevOps, it is a concatenation of development and operations, a method that emphasizes collaboration between the entire spectrum of professionals involved in creation, development, and deployment of software. That's really straightforward, right? It's a really cool definition. It seems to answer all the questions. But does it? Let's take a look at some of the history and see if we could actually put the pieces together. We'll start by defining the parts of DevOps. We don't want to go too far without definition. If you saw Leslie's talk this morning, I thought it was great that she was like, let's start with definitions, because when you define things, everybody's on the same ground. So we'll start with development. What is development? It's code, right? Right? Okay, you're all super energetic before lunch, cool. So development can mean a lot more than code. When we say development, do we mean specifically the code that runs the back-end function of our applications, the structure of it, the staples that are keeping the application alive and vibrant? Are we talking about the front end, UI, UX? Are we talking about any of the code that goes into seeing if the actual thing works? The functionality? I mean, essentially, some people may ask themselves, do we need anything more than HTML, CSS, and maybe a little PHP on the back end to process forms? And because this is a talk that mentions philosophy, I have to do this sometimes. For our purposes, we'll say development is all of those things that I just mentioned. It's everything that makes an application run. All of the code, all of the UI, all of it. So next we have QA. QA, the piece that never fits conveniently into the word DevOps, and the piece that people generally forget. But there's still parts to define there. Is QA unit tests that I write on my code, that I run myself? Is it testing things in the browser? Is it having users test things? Is it beta testing, A/B testing? What does QA mean? Again, for our purposes, we'll say it's all of that. It's all of those things. You'll also notice like dev qua ops didn't really work out. So like QA and testing, there was no way to get it in the word. So people often forget about it. Then we have operations. Back in the day, we used to have these things called systems administrators. There's also a derogatory term, cable jockeys. This is because often we had like a server in a closet with a bunch of wires sticking out of it that only one person in our organization actually knew how the thing worked. And sometimes it didn't. Then we moved to co-location facilities and we're like, cool, now that one person who knows what we work has to leave the building to go fix it. Then we moved on to cloud and things like that. There's a lot that goes into actually building infrastructure, and we've come a long way from sticking a server in the closet and hoping for the best. But let's look at each of the pieces individually. And let's look at a little history too. Today, we think of DevOps as a set of behaviors that allows a team to function. That's even more basic than the definition that I read. Behaviors that allow a team to function. You'll notice I didn't say a bunch of tools that automate our ability to function. It's behaviors. This idea differs slightly from the agile mindset. Agile was a concept where it was like, hey, we're all going to work together to be flexible. We want to be flexible. That's what agile sounds like. But it started to get bogged down in tools and redundant things. How many people have worked at a place that does waterfall? How many people work at a place that say they do agile? How many people still use a waterfall structure while they're saying they're doing agile? Doing agile doesn't mean doing waterfall with a scrum master. Doesn't mean that we have daily stand-ups and now we're automatically agile. It's an adoption of a set of behaviors, just like DevOps. DevOps extends the agile mindset. That's kind of the whole point. The focus of DevOps is we want to build a product. That product is generally an application, whether it be web, mobile, whatever. NFT, we're not going to get into that. But we're building a thing. We want this thing to work. We want it to be as available to people as possible. The best way to do that is to set up our behavior for success. So knowing the parts doesn't mean we completely understand the ideas behind everything, how it works together. So we have to go back to the beginning. There was this conference called Agile Systems Administration. That's a sexy title. And these two guys came up and they're like, hey, we can extend Agile. We can make it a little bit different. Patrick Dubois and Andrew Clay Schaefer, who probably don't appreciate me using these ridiculously horrid pictures of them. But that was their pictures on the conference website. And they were like, hey, so let's build this thing. What are we going to call it? We'll call it DevOps. And how are we going to define it? A set of practices intended to reduce the time between committing a change to a system and the change being placed into normal production while ensuring high quality. That seems to be closer to our current concept of what we actually want to do when we build applications. It's a more modernized definition. I think it really starts to fit, but we can start to even make that better because that was 2008. In 2008, half the people in this room didn't have smartphones. You had like a Nokia piece of crap or like a BlackBerry. I had a BlackBerry, and I'm not ashamed to admit that. I had a BlackBerry. It had a whole keyboard. It was brilliant. Things have changed a lot since then. So let's look at how this works. The philosophy itself actually goes far beyond the work cycle. The focus is how members of teams function together and with other teams. The idea is to be most successful. This means taking into account some of the overarching pieces of the puzzle: development, testing, integration, deployment, monitoring, and systems administration, which is all part of that like release package verify cycle. If you've been to a DevOps conference before, you have seen this image 100,000 times. How many of you, before we go much further, how many of you think you're already doing DevOps? Don't be ashamed. Get your hands up. Come on. That was the slowest hand raising I've ever seen in my life. It was like, I think, maybe. All right. I'll let you judge as we move forward if you're actually doing DevOps. Let's see how things work in your organization. One of the things that's key to talk about when it comes to DevOps is automation. Everyone loves to talk about automation. Oh, we're going to automate this. We're going to make it possible. I mean, JR just talked about in his talk, automating it so that his people could use Blender instantly using Lambdas. Like, that's great. Automation generally, especially for developers, is like a super fearful thing. Like, so wait, you're going to automate this process? Does that mean I'm going to like get rid of my job? No. What you're doing is you're trying to build things to eliminate errors. You're building very simple automations at first to get rid of menial tasks that can cause problems later. So you get them out of the way, you automate them. To be honest, there's no reason why we should fear automation. How many of you have been in an elevator in the past, whatever? Everyone should have their hand up. Everyone has been in an elevator. How many of you have had to tip the elevator operator because that's how elevators operate? Yeah, automation's not a new thing. It doesn't necessarily erase industries. I mean, it did in the elevator situation, but automation is not a way to ditch engineers. The idea is to make our lives easier. Another big concept when it comes to DevOps is the concept of chaos. How many people know what chaos engineering is? How many people are terrified by it? So if you don't know, we'll do a little background. There was this small company that used to package DVDs and send them to your house. Eventually, they realized it was better if they just showed you this stuff and not send the DVD because they don't know what condition it's going to come back in. They realized that they had a huge infrastructure situation, so they decided they really needed to see how stable it was. They wanted to know what would happen if we, I don't know, drop half of our production instances all of a sudden at 8 o'clock on a Friday night, the number one time that everyone is watching Netflix. Half of their production. What do you think happened? I know it's before lunch, you don't have to answer me. And also there was a lack of coffee, so I get it. No one noticed. I mean, the SREs, the infrastructure staff, the coders, they all noticed. Users, no one noticed. So they realized two things. One, their staff is really good at responding quickly. They responded within 4 minutes. That's an amazing response time when someone just magically takes down half your stack. And two, if the users don't notice, we're pretty good. Maybe we don't need quite as many instances as we thought. That's chaos engineering in a nutshell, because this wasn't a fire drill. When you have a fire drill and someone says, hey, at 3 o'clock we're gonna have a fire drill, you're like, okay, cool, I'll go outside and go grab a coffee across the street. Then after I say that the lights are not blinking anymore, I'll go back in. Okay, that's not really a fire drill, because if a fire is there, you're like, holy shit, this place is on fire, I need to get out of here. So with chaos engineering, it's the same idea. You say, holy shit, half of our production is gone, what should we do? It sounds terrifying, not just to coders, not just to SREs, but also to managers. Like, they're totally freaking out about this. But what it does is it actually brings people together. And that's something that, I feel like Leslie did half my talk this morning, by the way. I forgive you, but I'm a little angry. But the problem is siloing. A lot of times you have issues where people weren't talking to each other. So an emergency would come up, whether a chaos engineering experiment or in a real life outage. And the coders would be like, I don't know what's going on. And the SREs would be like, where are the coders? Because you deployed this and that's why we're having a problem. And the silos were the problem. DevOps wants to destroy siloing. How do we do that? That's the trick. I'm going to tell you at the end of the talk. But that was the main focus on DevOps. Functioning together. So let's look at some of the parts. Let's look at some of the tooling and how these things actually work together. First, we want to start off with our development tools. And there is literally a never-ending list of possibilities. First, you have to select a programming language. This is often dependent on what you want to do. Let's say you want to have a simple web-based application. Ruby, Elixir, they'll do the work for you. You want something a little more analytical, Python, R. These will suit your needs. You want a tried and true language that is dependable in the enterprise? Java is available. Perl is actually also really cool again, if you want to get into that. But there's so many options. And the interesting thing is it doesn't stop at that. It used to be when you got a job, especially as a coder, you would go in and you would do like a job. You're like, hey, so I used to work at a company called Engine Yard. We talked about that earlier. At Engine Yard, we built everything in Ruby on Rails. The whole stack was Ruby on Rails, the whole thing, from top to bottom. You would never do that today. Today, let's say you want to build a microblogging website where you can say weird things and people will judge you for it. You probably want to use Ruby for the back end, a little bit of Java, plenty of JavaScript because everybody needs that, a little bit of PHP, and a little bit of standardizing Python code for your analytics on the back end so people can figure out how many people liked the thing that they said. That is literally Twitter's stack. That is Stripe's stack. That is so many companies. You don't have to be religiously evangelical about the language you are coding in. This makes it easier to build a bigger community internally of coders who can do different things. They start to communicate, you realize what the best tool for the job is. Languages aside, the key here is that we're making applications that are usable to make our users' lives better and easier. How many people have some kind of like mission statement where they work like, we are here to make our users' lives better? How many people have a mission statement that says, we are here to make our developer and SRE lives better? Wow, that was some harsh laughter right there. I don't know where that came from, but it's true. we should be, DevOps wants to focus on making the team's lives better. That's the whole point. I mean, we're all lucky enough to have, the need, we can run our own repo servers, we can build all our stuff. We have great stuff like Bitbucket and GitHub and GitLab. We don't need to run like SVN locally on an old Dell laptop that maybe has like enough memory to grill a cheese sandwich or something like that. But like we actually have all these great cloud solutions. So we have places to give code, places to get code. The one thing I loved about JR's thing was he talked about that New York Times Blender repo, and like you can go and get started right away. We don't have to learn from scratch every single time, and that's great. This is all part of our goal. We want to make lives easier. I studied computer science when I was at school because I wanted to be a programmer. Actually, I wanted to make money. Let's be honest. It was like a job. It was like, you can make money doing this. I'm like, all right. My minor was in anthropology. You cannot make money doing that. You just can't. But one of the things you learn in anthropology is the word technology, what it's meant to mean is a tool that makes humans' lives easier. So we've all seen the example of like the chimp takes the stick and he sticks it in the tree and the ants get on the tree and you can eat the ants. Don't eat ants, they're super gross. But he is using technology. The technology is the stick. The stick's purpose is not to get ants out of a tree. He's figuring out how to use that tool, how to build it to make his life easier so he could eat as many ants as he wants. Tools are important. They're meant to make our lives easier. A little bit of a rant here. You may have noticed that most of the languages that I mentioned are open source. I love open source. I love open source. The thing about open source is it kind of lowers the bar. Anyone can get started. Anyone can use it. Anyone can be a part of it. All you really need is a computer and a fairly decent connection to the internet. Open source is the way of the future. DevOps success, in my mind, is based on open source. A lot of the tools that I talk about are built using open source technology if they aren't open source themselves. So that's cool. Incorporate open source into your DevOps practices. It doesn't mean you have to give away the ghost. You don't have to give up your business logic just to be doing DevOps. But it helps the community when you share as much as you possibly can. So let's talk about testing. I hate testing. Thank you. Boo. No, I hate writing code tests is really what it is. I'm a bad programmer. But there's so many tools that have been built that help us with that. Some of them on the coding side have been built right into the language, things like RSpec and other tools that just allow us to say, okay, so I'm building this thing and it totally works. Cool, I don't have to worry about that. But there's also certain things that we can do to start testing the way that our code is actually used, because I'm sure we've all either been coders or worked with coders that have a vision of the way the thing is going to be used, and you put it out in the world, and holy shit, that is not the way it gets used. There's things like Selenium that allows you to do browser testing. You can see how everything looks, not just the UI, but the functionality. This is important, especially when you're talking about accessibility. Also important, not what this talk is about. There's WAPT, also pronounced WAPT. It is not a dirty rap song. It is an amazing load testing and stress testing tool that is open source. There's also Qtest, which is a suite of tools used for quality control on your application. So you can ensure, and this is before we even get to CI/CD, you can ensure that there's quality before we get to that point, which is awesome. Additionally, there's services like Rainforest QA. If you're just like, I hate testing, I hate QA, we don't have a big, huge budget where we can hire a bunch of people to do this for me, cool, I'll just send it to Rainforest QA, they'll do it for me. So there's lots of options when it comes to testing. Testing, though, is kind of a never-ending cycle. Like, we had that big circle, and like almost unto itself, testing is its own circle within a circle. It comes out, though, we finally get a thing. Hopefully, we get a thing, and it comes out, and we have to decide how it actually mixes in with everything else. So we start with continuous integration. Here, the tools aren't surprising. Continuous integration is just a way to mix all of the code together into a batch that makes the great things that makes people want to buy the fancy cars that you're selling. I don't know what you people do for a living. But the idea here, it's very simple. You have things like Travis CI, Circle CI. Tools are really easy to integrate into what you do. They integrate into GitHub and Bitbucket and GitLab, no problem. It's seamless integration. You don't have to worry about it. You can write your code, send it to QA. QA can push it up. You can see if it's ready to go. Then you have things like continuous delivery. Some people call it continuous deployment. There's a minor difference between those two things, but continuous delivery is ensuring that you're actually bringing the app to production the way that you want to. And there's lots of cool things. There's Go CD, which I'm a big fan of. Not to be confused with the Go programming language, which is also pretty cool. But Go CD is basically to look at all of your integrated streams and see, is this going to match with production? Can I let this go? Can I push this up in a way that's going to be successful? creating pipelines. Then, of course, we have infrastructure. And if I'm saying DevOps is a buzzword, God, is it not alone? Cloud services, containerization, Docker, Kubernetes, serverless. All of these are buzzwords. Just a little bit different from the way it was about 20 years ago when startups in San Francisco would just use stupid words that didn't make any sense to talk about their product. Like, I love Heroku. That word doesn't mean anything. When it first came out, everybody was like, yeah, I'm using Heroku. I'm like, do you need help? Are you on drugs? I worked at a company called Engine Yard. Does anyone know what Engine Yard did? Not you. Platform as a service. So we would help you deploy your code to AWS in one click. It was supposed to be super simple. But I would walk around with my t-shirt on and people would be like, so you work with Amtrak? Who named this company? But all of which is to say, marketing of these words has gotten better. These things kind of make sense. However, all the things that I just said, cloud, serverless, Kubernetes, all of that basically boils down to what those of us who are a little bit older might recognize as the term hosting solutions. It's a place to put your application. It's important here to note, too, that if you work for a large enterprise, some of these might be new ideas. Maybe not to you, but to your organization they are. And I'll tell a little story because I'm no longer legally bound to not tell this story. A few years ago, before I started DevRelate, I was working at a company called International Business Machines. And this is in 2016, mind you, that I'm telling this story. And I started the job, and I was working with the cloud team, and they were like, yo, there's this really new concept about how teams should work together. I'm like, oh my God, they know about DevOps? This is great. Like, it's called Agile. I was like, Agile, the thing from 1993? Is that when it came out? I don't know, we just heard about it. We just found out. But what it is when you work for those large, older enterprises, they're just late to adopt new technologies. This makes the DevOps journey and applying the Devops philosophy much more difficult. Like, if you're working at a startup, it's easy. There's probably a smaller team. It's not a big deal. IBM literally has 600,000 employees. Try getting DevOps into a 600,000 employee company that just found out Agile was a thing 5 years ago. But it's key to keep at it. You have to bring them into the modern age. That's just a little rant. If you work for a large enterprise, these things will be more difficult. While the industry itself moves forward, the adoption of newer infrastructure moves at a much slower pace across the board, whether you're at a big enterprise or not. For example, organizations that are larger are just now beginning to feel safe using containers, Docker. Like, that's a new thing to them. They don't feel like they want to use it until it's stable. So things like Docker and Kubernetes. Kubernetes is terrifying to people. Terrifying, because it does way too much. And if you want to talk about Kubernetes, we could do that later, but it's a lot, man. Like, it's a lot. It comes with a lot of baggage. But organizations are now beginning to feel safe moving to containers and say, like, okay, we can containerize a little bit. We can start to use serverless. We can leverage that a little bit to bring our costs down. And cloud is like the most popular thing in the world. But then there's always this circle in technology where there's a lot of places that are actually going back to bare metal, building their own server farms, or smaller organizations that are finding that there's options. There's a company, it's called Redwood. I don't know what the company's called Redwood. I can't remember the name of the product offhand, but they actually build small desktop servers that slide underneath your desk. So if you have a startup that's like 7 people, you just each have one underneath your desk. There's your cloud. Put it behind a firewall. Do whatever you want with it. Super safe. Really awesome. So you can see that there's different tools that fit different needs. Once you decide how you want to do it, which infrastructure technologies you want to adopt, the team, the system administrators are what they were called back in the day. Now they call them DevOps. They use it like a noun, like a title, which that's weird. But they're going to be there to handle every single thing that happens to that application once it is ready to deploy and once it's been deployed. This team includes ops experts, troubleshooters, and this is where your database team comes in. Your designers and your coders work together with the database team to figure out what's going on. But there's also the figuring out what is going on, and I'm not going to belabor this too much because Leslie really talked very well about this, about the idea of monitoring and observability. It used to be that observability was a concept where you couldn't look into a system. You had to extrapolate out and infer what was going on. Now we have lots of great tools like Humio, the Elastic Stack, Datadog. All those are great tools where you can actually look and say, okay, I can see what's happening in real time, but don't get caught up on that word real time. because that's a lie. None of these are in real time. They all have to ingest data, process it, and then display it. That takes time. It might be seconds, but it's still time. Does anyone know how long it takes for someone to kind of give up on your application? 3 seconds. Well, 4 seconds. The average, 3 or 4 seconds. We'll say 3 or 4 seconds. We'll meet halfway. After 3 or 4 seconds, they will click reload. If your stuff does not show up because you put way too much JavaScript in it, they're going to go somewhere else to find the services they need. Now, this whole thing is great, but like, how does it all work together? Well, that's where the new jobs of DevOps come in. That's where the SREs, the site reliability engineers, come in, the chaos engineers who are figuring out what's going on in production. They're able to take all that and get the real-time instant feedback that they need. They can fix a database in production without causing too much trouble. They can work together with the dev team, with the QA team to ensure everything you're deploying is working because you can see it. But all of this doesn't matter. Everything I've talked about in this talk up to this point doesn't matter. None of those tools matter, none of those products matter. Because you know what actually makes a difference in DevOps? Communication. I mentioned that DevOps is a set of behaviors. It's not a set of tools. The tools for communication here, they're pretty straightforward. Mattermost, HipChat, Slack, Rocket Chat, IRC. Who remembers IRC? Yeah. No moderation, absolutely terrifying. So it's not difficult, but people are like, well, but PJ, communication, I mean, come on, we all communicate. Do you? Do you? Communication means being open and honest with people. Telling them, like, listen, I'm sorry, your code didn't make the cut. It didn't actually come in. It's, you know, Andrew talked about this in his talk at the opening. A way to just say, hey, listen, this part doesn't fit. And I'm not talking about you as a person. I'm just saying the code doesn't work the way we want it to. Remember, we all agreed on the way we wanted to? You have to communicate your needs, communicate what the team needs, communicate what's best for the organization. This is all key, and that's why it's a philosophy. Philosophy, look. Communication is the only tool to DevOps that actually matters. We can look at all the tools, and I'll show you the list of tools that we have. And all of that is like super important. Your organization has to be able to figure out how it works. You have to be able to figure out how to build code. But we know how to do this. We've been doing it for 50 years. That part's not hard. Finding a tool is not hard. Freaking Google it. You'll find something that works. Get past the vendor ads first. Maybe use a DuckDuckGo browser, because that way you can just see the actual things that you're looking for and not the ads. Thank you. It's open source. But the idea is, if you can't communicate these things, none of it matters. With competing tools, it's hard to say what the perfect setup will be, and that's why I'm not prescribing any of the things that I just said. I mentioned what's worked for me in the past at various different jobs. I've been a coder, I've been an SRE, I've been a support staff, and now I do DevRel. I actually was at one point in time a database administrator. It's how you learn that spreadsheets are the most powerful database that ever existed. Sorry, that's just the truth. But how do you adopt DevOps? The first thing is you start with communication. You go back to your company, your organization, and you say, hey, there's this really cool guy from Buffalo, New York that I saw. His name's PJ. And you should blame everything I'm about to say on him. But he said that if we start communicating, maybe we can actually have a better DevOps setup here. What's DevOps, you say? It's a set of behaviors that allows us to produce a better product, to give our users a better thing. Whatever that thing is, we can make things better if we communicate, if we set up our behavior for success. We can call ourselves a DevOps organization, we can have this philosophy, and we can actually build the tools that we need to see in the world. And with that, thank you very much. You can go to lunch now.